Okay, let's dive right into this. When we think about the history of science, we usually picture this very sanitized, almost cinematic version of events, right? We imagine a lone, brilliant mind standing in front of a chalkboard, having this sudden eureka moment that just changes the world forever. But today, we're going to deeply rethink that neat and tidy narrative. In this explainer, we're going to look at the messy, collaborative, and sometimes profoundly unfair reality of how scientific history has actually been made. And honestly, more importantly, who actually got the credit for making it.
It brings up a question we really need to ask ourselves. Do scientific breakthroughs really happen in a sudden flash of genius? If you look at your standard textbooks, discoveries are almost always presented as these neat logical mathematical deductions. You get the definition, the theorem, the proof, all wrapped up with a neat little bow. But actually, scratch that. That kind of retrospective storytelling can be incredibly frustrating for anyone trying to learn how science actually works in the real world. It completely hides the winding paths, the dead ends, and the years of just grueling effort that go into a single breakthrough.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is when you consider the highly composed, dignified portraits of famous historical figures like Johannes Kepler. I mean, seeing him depicted so calmly, you'd think he just gazed peacefully up at the stars and effortlessly jotted down his famous laws of planetary motion. But the painful, frustrating reality of his actual research process, it couldn't be further from this calm depiction.
The truth is, Kepler agonized over observational data like a giant cosmic puzzle for literally decades. He spent years just pushing data around, constantly trying new approaches, tossing out his own results and wrestling with the math until he was practically pulling his hair out. Real science isn't just about raw intellect. It's a messy, exhausting, and deeply human struggle. And recognizing that struggle is really the first step in understanding the true history of how we've mapped our universe.
And speaking of mapping the universe, historically, it wasn't just the quote-unquote professionals doing the heavy lifting. Back in the day, official institutions and universities simply didn't have the manpower or the observatories to map the entire sky. This left a massive vacuum, and it was filled by what Victorian England called grand amateurs. We're talking about incredibly wealthy folks, like highly successful brewers, for instance, who essentially said, you know what, I'll just do it myself. They built massive private observatories right in their backyards and funded professional astronomers out of their own pockets to drive these early discoveries.
And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer scale of these amateur setups. Lord Rosse built a massive 72-inch reflector telescope, famously dubbed the Leviathan of Parsonstown. This thing remained the absolute largest telescope in the world until 1917, and it was built entirely by an amateur. But right alongside these towering physical tools, we have the unsung human heroes of astronomy. Pioneers like Caroline Herschel, who scanned the heavens alongside her brother and made absolutely foundational discoveries, yet often remained hidden in the shadows of a heavily male-dominated field.
And Herschel definitely wasn't alone. Astronomy has this rich, deep history of hidden female pioneers who achieved incredible things through sheer intellect and just immense stamina. Women like Maria Kunitz, Caroline Herschel, and Maria Mitchell made groundbreaking observations. And then you have someone like Annie Cannon at the Harvard College Observatory. Listen to this. She didn't just look at a few stars. She manually analyzed nearly 400,000 stellar spectra. 400,000! Her work remains a monumental milestone in spectral classification today. Yet, despite these staggering contributions, women in science continually had to fight tooth and nail for just basic recognition.
Let's move to and see how this builds. How do these individual historical stories build into a massive, undeniable, macro-level pattern? To truly understand how credit has been distributed or, withheld entirely, we have to look way beyond individual anecdotes and analyze the permanent record of human knowledge, academic publishing. By examining literally millions of published papers over the last century, we can actually measure the systemic biases that pioneers like Caroline Herschel and Annie Cannon faced every single day. Which brings us to a really crucial concept, the Matilda effect. Named after the 19th century suffragette and critic Matilda Joslyn Gage, this effect describes the systematic undervaluation, underrecognition, and historical erasure of women's contributions in science. Basically, it's the phenomenon where female innovations are routinely ignored, minimized, or just entirely misattributed to their male colleagues. It's kind of the dark counterpart to the Matthew effect, where already famous scientists get disproportionate credit. The Matilda effect? That's all about who gets rendered invisible.
To figure out exactly how prevalent this effect has been, researchers recently analyzed an absolutely breathtaking scale of data. They looked at over 220 million publications between the years 1900 and 2025 using the OpenAlex database. Just think about that number for a second. 220 million. We're talking about analyzing practically the entire collective, permanent record of modern human knowledge just to track exactly how female participation and recognition have evolved over the last 125 years.
So the crucial point is how we actually measure this recognition using all that data. The researchers did this by comparing two specific things: overall female authorship versus female corresponding authorship. Now, in science, just being on the author list is one thing, but being the corresponding author usually means you're the primary investigator. It's the boss role. It's the intellectual and organizational driving force behind the whole shebang. So by comparing how many women are authors overall to how many are in that prestigious lead position, we can precisely measure if women are being systematically excluded from receiving primary credit.
When we map this data out, we see the overall share of female authors steadily growing over time. That's great. But the Matilda effect ratio tells a very different story. For most of the 20th century, that ratio remains stubbornly above 1. In practical terms, this proves that even as more women entered the lab and did the actual, grueling work, they were systematically blocked from leadership roles relative to their overall participation. They did the science, sure, but they definitely didn't get top billing.
But, science doesn't just happen in a vacuum, right? It is deeply, deeply tethered to sociology and massive global events. If you look at the timeline of the data here, you see these huge structural shocks. During World War II, right around 1940, there's a distinct, sharp spike in female publication shares. Why? Well, because a massive proportion of male researchers were drafted into the military, and that created this huge academic vacuum that women stepped up to fill. But then right after the war, 1945, boom, there's a sharp drop as returning men reclaim those positions and completely displace the women. It really wasn't until the structural expansion and second-wave feminism of the 1970s that we started to see a sustained, steady upward momentum for women in science.
Now, looking at the landscape today, while global trends are generally improving, which is awesome, stark disparities absolutely still remain depending on where you look. In the physical sciences, the overall female share remains the lowest, whereas the health sciences are actively approaching gender parity. Geographically, Latin America is doing exceptionally well. They're closely approaching parity in publications. However, several Asian countries persistently lag behind, remaining the only major region where male authors still heavily dominate those corresponding leadership authorship positions.
But wait, there is incredibly good news hidden in the recent data. If we look at the annual growth rate of female corresponding authorship over the last few decades, we see a totally remarkable shift. In the most recent 20 years, that historical Matilda effect ratio has actually inverted globally. It finally dropped below the parity limit. This literally means the traditional systemic bias of excluding women from the lead author position is fundamentally collapsing on a global scale. It's a real game changer.
To summarize this incredible shift, overall female participation has absolutely skyrocketed from around 10% a century ago to over 40% today. We've even reached a point in the past 2 decades where women are now slightly overrepresented in lead publication roles relative to their participation rate. That is a triumphant decline of the historical Matilda effect. However, the data also flashes a bit of a yellow caution light. That rapid gap closing we saw over the last 15 years, it's actually starting to level off to a growth rate of about 0.2 percentage points. So the gap is closing for sure, but the engine of progress might be cooling just a little bit.
So why does all of this actually matter? Well, it matters because science is built on the shoulders of those who came before us. Understanding our messy, biased, and deeply human past is really the only way we can prevent ourselves from wandering down the wrong paths in the future. Acknowledging that scientific progress relies on wide, messy collaboration, and crucially, acknowledging those who were unfairly erased from the record, ensures that our future scientific endeavors are not only more accurate, but fundamentally more fair.
Which leaves us with one final, vital thought to ponder. We've seen how centuries of brilliant minds, from the agonizing Kepler to the tireless Annie Cannon, shaped our world. And we've seen how millions of female scientists fought a massive systemic tide to finally get the credit they deserve today. If a broad historical basis prevents us from wandering down the wrong paths, who will we make sure to include in the scientific history written tomorrow? Thank you so much for exploring this fascinating data with me.